On the morning of April 29th, 1791, two unfamiliar ships dropped anchor near the southern tip of the Key Peninsula, the Lady Washington and the Grace. Although the unannounced visitors looked Russian to Japanese eyes, most of them, along with their captain John Kendrick, hailed from the United States of America, the first Americans in Japan whose visit we can describe in any detail. According to the logbook of the Grace, the only first-hand documentation on the American side, locals greeted the foreigners by shooing them away. Rather than comply, the Lady Washington sent two boats ashore to gather water. Wary villagers watched from a distance with spears at the ready. They must also have alerted the authorities because Japanese sources tell us that within the day, village headman Nakanishi Dizayemon had received word of the foreign ships and sent a report to his superior in accordance with domain protocol. Curiosity soon overcame caution, for on the third day, villagers flocked on board and presented Captain Kendrick with wood and bags of rice. This seems to have been the only time that the Americans were able to interact with the locals up close, but it was enough for Kendrick to later recount that they had been received by the natives with the greatest hospitality. What exactly transpired during this historic encounter we'll never know, but one source on the Japanese side notes that villagers were invited on board and treated to food and drink. The foreigners also gave them a piece of paper bearing a message. While the Americans, of course, couldn't understand Japanese, they had sailed from Macau with a couple of Chinese men, making communication in written Chinese possible. The message identified the foreigners as red hairs from the land of the flowery flag, using the Chinese nicknames for white people and the Stars and Stripes respectively. It claimed that the ships were only there to take shelter from a storm and would leave as soon as the winds turned favorable. Following the Chinese writing, a signature in sideways letters read, "John Kendrick, commander of the brig Lady Washington of Boston, New England, United States of America." The Americans' arrival was not as accidental as they claimed. The logbook of the Grace records for May 3rd, "They seem to want nothing we can offer them. They give us to understand that their chiefs or headmen will not allow them to trade or supply us with anything. If they do, they signify they shall be put to death for it." And the following morning, after finding no probability of trading with the natives, the ships began preparations to leave for their ultimate destination, the northwest coast of North America. There, Captain Kendrick met up with fellow Americans and told them the true intentions behind his brief stop in Japan. They had been carrying about 200 prime sea otter skins, but found that the Japanese knew not the use of them, and so, not finding a good sale for their furs, made but a short tarry. What were Americans doing in the Far East, and why were they trying to sell sea otter furs? Well, it was just 1 decade earlier when the United States won its independence with a decisive victory at Yorktown. The split with Britain cut American merchants off from lucrative trade outlets throughout the empire, namely the West Indies, but also opened up new opportunities in the East Indies. Just 1 month after Congress ratified the Treaty of Paris, crowds gathered in New York Harbor to see off the Empress of China, which would become the first American ship to reach the bustling port of Canton. Americans had long since had a voracious appetite for Chinese goods, in particular tea, their favorite drink, but under British rule the East India Company had a monopoly on the Asian trade, and to see how American patriots felt about that, one need look no further than the Boston Tea Party. If tea imported by the British before independence symbolized oppression, then the same good procured directly by Americans after independence symbolized freedom. The Empress of China sought to bring home national pride as well as profit. One poet wrote, "She now her eager course explores, and soon shall greet Chinesian shores, from thence their fragrant teas to bring, without the leave of Britain's king. Unfortunately, Americans faced the same problem as all Europeans trying to access the riches of the East, which was that China didn't want to buy anything from them, except for silver. But silver was in short supply in the early Republic, which had been financially exhausted by the War for Independence, and now found itself amid a severe economic depression. The Empress of China carried ginseng as a substitute, but despite all the fanfare surrounding its voyage, returned with only modest profits. The Chinese considered American ginseng to be vastly inferior to Asian varieties. In 1784, a promising alternative surfaced in the shape of a furry marine mammal. This year saw the publication of the official account of Captain James Cook's third and final voyage in the Pacific. During a stop at Nootka Sound near present-day Vancouver, the expedition purchased sea otter pelts from Native Americans for iron scraps and glass beads, and to the crew's astonishment, the fur sold at Canton for a profit of 1,800%. Buyers flocked to Canton all the way from northern China, where Manchu elites used sea otter fur to stay snug and fashionable during the harsh winters. The emperor himself would wear his dragon robe trimmed with sea otter fur, and by this time the fashion had spread to the Chinese as well. Everybody who could afford it wore fur, even down south in Canton. This soft gold, as it came to be called, had long been prized throughout the North Pacific. On Japan's northern frontier in Ezo, for example, sea otter pelts were one of the most valuable goods traded between the Ainu and Japanese. On the other side of the ocean, the Lewis and Clark expedition saw some for the first time in 1805 at the mouth of the Columbia River. William Clark called the fur the richest and I think the most delightful fur in the world, describing it as deep, thick, silky in the extreme and strong. It would be the future namesake of the Columbia to first set out from New England in search of this golden fleece. On September 30th, 1787, the Columbia Redeviva and its companion sloop Lady Washington departed Boston for the northwest coast. Like the Empress of China, they sailed for more than just profit. Joseph Barrel, the voyage's principal investor, had coins made to commemorate the first American adventure to the Pacific Ocean. The lesser ones, made of pewter, were to be distributed among the natives on the coast, while the silver and copper medals were sent to such dignitaries as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Commanding the voyage from the Columbia was John Kendrick, an experienced whaler from Cape Cod, who had made a name for himself as a privateer during the Revolution. Indeed, many of the sailors who pioneered the China trade had served in the war. After a tumultuous journey around Cape Horn, the Columbia and Lady Washington arrived at Nootka Sound, where they found themselves caught in the middle of an imperial power struggle. Spain had been creeping up the west coast of North America since the 1760s, spurred to action by news of Russian activity in Alaska. Though the Spanish were aware of the market for furs in Asia, their primary objective on the northwest coast was to create a buffer zone between other European powers and the Californias and Mexico. The first challenges to Spanish claims over the area would come not from the Russians but the British, who, like the Americans, came seeking lucrative furs in the wake of Captain Cook. In the summer of 1789, the Americans witnessed a Spanish naval commander seize 4 British trading vessels. Though the Americans faced interrogation as well, they escaped danger by siding against their former colonial masters. The crew of the Argonaut, the last British ship to sail into the trap, found themselves staring down the cannons of both a Spanish frigate and John Kendrick's Columbia. This standoff would nearly lead to war between Britain and Spain, but in the meantime, the Americans were free to go about their business. Kendrick swapped ships, taking control of the Lady Washington, while the Columbia went on ahead to Canton and then Boston, returning to great fanfare as the first American vessel to circumnavigate the globe. After lingering on the coast for a while, Kendrick also made it to China, but rather than sail back to Boston, he had a different idea in mind. While in Macau, he teamed up with one of the British captains he had met earlier at Nootka Sound, William Douglas, who had now taken command of an American ship, the Grace. The two decided to take a crack at the Japanese market, resulting in the encounter discussed at the beginning of this video. As we saw, their attempt to trade didn't go anywhere, and after that they parted ways, with the Lady Washington returning to the northwest coast. It's not quite clear how Kendrick got the idea to go to Japan in the first place. The topic may have come up in discussions with his sponsor Joseph Barrel. We know that the Columbia was sent back out on a second voyage to the coast, this time with instructions from Barrel to try what can be done on the coast of Japan and Peking, after loading up on furs. Whatever the case, no matter how foolish the plan may seem in hindsight given its utter failure, it likely wasn't far-fetched in the eyes of those involved. As we'll discuss shortly, the other British merchants active in the fur trade also had their eyes set on Japan. But first, what impact did the Lady Washington's appearance have in Japan? As we saw, what limited interactions the Americans had with the locals were generally peaceful. Japanese sources note that there was nothing too suspicious about the foreigners, other than the loud cannon fire, which was likely just a salute that the Japanese didn't know how to interpret. A contingent of samurai was dispatched from the castle town of Wakayama, but by the time they arrived on the scene, the foreigners were nowhere to be found. Though the whole affair turned out to be rather uneventful, rumors quickly spread beyond the key domain. Just 3 weeks after the Lady Washington and Grace had first been sighted, the radical imperial loyalist Takayama Hikokuro was out drinking in Kyoto with Nakai Chikusan, the head of a prestigious Confucian academy in Osaka. Chikusan had received a letter from one of his students whose family ran a pawn shop in Wakayama. Apparently, when word of the two barbarian ships reached the castle town, samurai scrambled to reclaim the weapons and armor they had pawned for cash. A few days later, Takayama heard further details from a court noble. Many more barbarian ships had appeared after the initial pair and started firing their cannons at each other. A lady then chimed in to share that, in response to the news, the imperial court had ordered shrines and temples to pray for the safety of the people. Later on, the rumors got even more detailed. Takayama writes in his diary that the barbarian fleet had in fact numbered 3 large ships and 50 or 60 smaller ones. Furthermore, many of the men on board seemed to be wearing Dutch clothing and must have been Russians. It's worth noting that even an expert who could distinguish between different European countries wouldn't have known that the United States was an independent country. In an 1807 treatise, one of the leading scholars of Western learning, Otsuki Gentaku, correctly identified the strange sideways letters in John Kendrick's signature as English, but to him, the Lady Washington was the first of many English ships coming to Japan with dubious intentions. American independence would only come to light in 1809. Speaking of English ships, an actual one showed up just 3 months after the Lady Washington. This was the Argonaut, commanded by James Colnett, a British naval officer who had once sailed with James Cook. He now sailed for the King George's Sound Company, whose grand object was to open a friendly intercourse with Japan, which they had every possible hope of accomplishing with the help of so great a temptation as sea otter skins. The source of this optimism was their advisor Joseph Banks, an influential figure in government circles for scientific and colonial affairs. Banks, in turn, had gotten the idea from his conversations with Carl Thunberg, a Swedish botanist who had stayed in Nagasaki with the Dutch. But despite the company's stated intentions, its traders never quite found the opportunity to stop in Japan, until 1791. Recall that as the Americans traded for furs at Nootka Sound in the summer of 1789, they looked on as the Spanish seized 4 British ships, the Argonaut among them. James Colnett, along with his ship and crew, was sent all the way to Mexico to be detained. He regained his freedom a year later, but his misfortunes did not end there. After returning to the northwest coast to pick up furs, Colnett finally made it to Macau in May of 1791, only to learn that the Chinese government had enacted a total ban on the fur trade. For the past few years, tensions had been escalating on the Qing Empire's northern border after a Russian gang harassed Chinese merchants. To the Qing, the fur trade was synonymous with Russia, due to their long-standing trade at the outpost of Kyakhta. So during this dispute, the Chinese government shut down trade not only at Kyakhta, but also banned the importation of furs in general. Bad timing thus left Colnett with little other choice. He would try to sell his cargo in Japan or Korea. The sailing orders given to Colnett by the merchant Daniel Beale, a partner in the venture, reveal an interesting mix of prudent and totally misinformed observations. Recognizing that the Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade in Japan and probably wouldn't welcome any infringement on their monopoly at Nagasaki, Beale advised Colnett to first go to Tsushima, which he mistakenly believed to be a trading hub controlled by Korea and frequented by Japanese merchants. Once there, if Colnett judged that his cargo could sell for more in Japan rather than Korea, he was to proceed to the shogun's capital in Edo, which almost certainly would not have ended well for anybody involved. Beale envisioned much more than a one-off voyage to sell some furs. The ultimate goal was to obtain permission for Britain to trade annually in Japanese ports, and so it was up to Colnett to impress the inhabitants with a favorable opinion of Europeans in general and Englishmen in particular. This would mean, among other things, confiscating alcohol from his men upon entering port, because English sailors were more addicted to intemperance in liquor than any other set of men. Beale explained that, with the Chinese, Japanese, and Eastern nations in general, a regularity of conduct, gravity of deportment, cleanliness, and courteous behavior were of the utmost importance. No part of this ambitious plan worked out. Colnett couldn't even find Tsushima, though not for lack of trying. In August of 1791, the Argonaut anchored in no less than 6 different places off the coast of western Japan as Colnett tried to find his destination, or any port that would accept him. It was all for naught, as he never managed to enjoy a friendly meal with the locals like Kendrick aboard the Lady Washington. Colnett and his men were welcomed by Japanese boats with gestures shooing them off to Nagasaki or signaling that they would lose their heads if they attempted to come ashore. Unfortunately, the Chinese man brought along as an interpreter did not understand a word of Japanese. The only furs Colnett managed to dispose of were 2 pieces which he gifted to samurai officials in an unsuccessful attempt to curry favor. After one particularly tense encounter in which the Argonaut fired on approaching guard boats, Colnett finally gave up and sailed for the southern coast of Korea, where he was met with similar hostility. A month and a half after the Argonaut's appearance, the shogunate decreed a new policy regarding the treatment of foreign ships. Upon sighting one, local authorities were to dispatch men to inspect the ship or communicate in writing, and if the foreigners cooperated, they were to be brought ashore and placed under watch while the authorities waited for further instructions from the shogunate. This decree, with its cautious and non-confrontational stance, established the baseline for the treatment of foreign ships for the next 35 years. It was the recognition of potential conflict which necessitated such caution. If the foreigners refused to cooperate, local authorities were to capture or kill using any means necessary. When dealing with a fleet of foreign ships, or a situation which called for more serious measures, officials on the ground were to coordinate with neighboring domains and mount a response as they saw fit. The decree marked a significant departure from previous instructions regarding foreign ships, which were almost exclusively concerned with preventing smuggling by Chinese junks, often taking an aggressive approach. For example, in 1717, the shogunate ordered the three domains of Fukuoka, Kokuda, and Choshu to crack down on smuggling near the Shimonoseki Strait by seizing the offending ships or bombarding them if met with resistance. This incident formed one of the only precedents that Choshu had to work with when the Argonaut appeared in those very same waters in 1791. But because protocol for dealing with foreign ships only covered Chinese smugglers, the domain was caught entirely off guard by the Argonaut, which in their eyes appeared to be a warship sent to scout out Japan. They were now dealing with a different beast. Within the text of the decree itself, only the Argonaut is alluded to as context for why the shogunate felt the need to issue a new set of instructions. However, the shift in policy should be viewed not as a specific reaction to the Argonaut, but rather a general response to the new and uncertain coastal security situation heralded by both the Argonaut and the American ships. When the shogunate's orders arrived in Wakayama, at least, they were prefaced by an allusion to the Lady Washington's appearance off the coast of that domain. And recall that rumors of the Russians had spread far and wide, even prompting the imperial court to commission prayers for the safety of the people. News of the Argonaut likewise took on a sensational flair. A retired official in Kyoto named Kanzawa Toko recorded rumors of war in Korea and battleships drifting ashore in western Japan. Fishermen could apparently hear shouting and the clanging of bells coming from the peninsula. While the basic locations and dates of the Argonaut's movements received by Kanzawa seem to be accurate, the number of foreign ships has been exaggerated from 1 to several or even thousands. He records this information next to rumors of a mermaid sighting, perhaps giving an indication of the quality of his newsfeed, but similar rumors seem to be making the rounds in Edo as well. Mizuno Tamenaga, an aide to the reigning senior counselor Matsudaira Sadanobu, recorded that within the shogunate, the Argonaut was initially believed to be an Asian merchant ship that had washed ashore. But as rumors of war between Russia and Korea spread, it now came to be seen as a Russian warship, and soon enough there was talk of a potential attack on Japan. As previously mentioned, this was a period of heightened tensions between Russia and Qing China. There was much plotting and talk of military confrontation, most of it unsubstantiated, but neither side seriously wanted conflict, and a peaceful agreement was reached in 1792. The Argonaut's transformation into Russian warship may have been spurred by rumors of these tensions on the Qing's northern border, along with Konnit's disastrous stopover in Korea. This was also a time when Russia's southern advance into Ezo was beginning to be viewed as a threat. In conclusion, then, the shogunate's 1791 decree signaled a recognition that Japan now found itself in a changing and unfamiliar international environment, which called for a more robust approach to coastal security. Daimyo who had once made their required trips to Edo by sea were ordered to do so once again to maintain naval power. The shogunate had in mind domains like Choshu, whose response to the Argonaut was criticized as inadequate. After switching to an overland route to Edo in 1725, Choshu's naval fleet had fallen into disrepair and was literally rotting away. Over a century of peace had blunted the might of a regime founded on military preparedness, and the cannons of the Lady Washington and Argonaut now rang out as a wake-up call. The unexpected guests of 1791 were only the first heralds of a new Pacific world brought closer together than ever, from the northwest coast of America to China's southern ports, all thanks to a furry sea mammal. Though the astonishing profits of the fur trade were ultimately short-lived, there would be new attractions to take its place. Whether it liked it or not, Japan now sat at the convergence of global currents, and it would not be able to keep them at bay for long.